My husband's betrayal exposed me as the real mastermind, but the man who just executed him now has my life in his sights. The crystal chandelier above refracted the champagne flute in my hand, turning the golden liquid into 1,000 tiny, mocking suns. This was it, the annual gala hosted by Mr. Sterling, the pinnacle of corporate success, and I, Amelia Hayes, was standing beside my husband, David, or at least what I thought was my husband. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low hum of power brokers discussing hostile takeovers. David, ever the golden boy, was deep in conversation with Sterling himself, his tailored suit perfectly accentuating the ambition I'd once admired, now just a suffocating cage. I needed air. I drifted toward the balcony, feeling the silence of my own isolation amidst the roar of forced merriment. That's when I saw the text message light up my phone screen. It wasn't a notification. It was an attachment, sent from an unknown encrypted number. My breath hitched. It was a photograph, and not just any photo. It was David, taken maybe 6 months ago, in a dimly lit warehouse space I'd never seen. He wasn't alone. He was standing over a stack of heavy, unmarked crates, talking intensely with 2 men whose faces were sharp, predatory, and utterly familiar from the whispers I'd always dismissed as paranoia. One of them was the notorious Silas, a name that only ever appeared in the darkest corners of financial crime reports. Reports David always laughed off as sensationalist garbage. My fingers trembled so violently I almost dropped the phone into the terraced garden below. I zoomed in on the crates. They weren't filled with inventory or legitimate goods. The way the harsh security light hit the surface of one box revealed a faint, dark residue seeping through a poorly sealed seam. It looked like residue from handling something highly toxic, or perhaps something illegal that required extreme precaution. I felt the nausea rise, the carefully constructed veneer of my perfect life beginning to crack like cheap plaster. David had always preached about ethics and legacy. He'd built his empire, he claimed, on transparency. Liar. I looked back at him. He was still laughing, a loud, confident bark that echoed across the marble floor. Sterling slapped him heartily on the back. David caught my eye for a brief second. He gave me a dismissive, patronizing smile, the kind one gives a spouse who is clearly being too emotional at a formal event. He mouthed something to me, without moving his lips enough for anyone else to notice. "Stop looking like you've seen a ghost, Amelia." The implication hit me like a physical blow. He knew I was hiding something. He knew I was distracted, and he certainly didn't suspect I knew his secret. I quickly saved the image and deleted the message thread. My mind was racing, trying to reconcile the man who tucked me in every night with the man pictured with known criminals discussing... what? Some kind of massive organized scheme that went far beyond simple corporate fraud. The weight of the potential Tyazykoy obvinenia that could land on our entire family name felt suffocating. I took a deep, controlled breath, smoothing down my gown. I had to play the part. I had to get close enough to know the scope of this disaster before the authorities, or worse, Sterling's rivals, found out and used David as the sacrificial lamb. I walked back toward the center of the room, plastering on the brittle smile of a supportive wife. I reached David just as he was taking a sip of his expensive scotch. "Darling," I purred, leaning in close enough to whisper so only he could hear, "that story you just told Sterling about the Singapore merger? It was brilliant, truly inspired." He beamed, soaking up the praise. "Thank you, sweetie. It's all about leverage, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, my voice dangerously soft. "Speaking of leverage, I think you dropped something important earlier." His eyes narrowed, the warmth instantly replaced by ice. He scanned the floor near his feet, confused. "What are you talking about, Amelia? I haven't dropped anything." I didn't look down. I looked directly into his eyes, letting a sliver of genuine, raw terror show through my facade. "No, David. Not on the floor. I think you dropped your connection to the real business, the one involving those men and those packages." The Scotch cup stopped halfway to his lips. His face didn't just go pale, it drained of all color, as if someone had pulled a plug on his very vitality. He didn't breathe. He looked past me, toward the entrance, as if expecting the doors to burst open right then and there. "What did you just say?" he choked out, his voice a thin, reedy whisper that didn't belong to the titan I married. I leaned in one last time, my lips brushing his earlobe, the scent of jasmine fighting the stench of fear now emanating from him. I whispered, my voice laced with cold finality. "I saw the picture of you with Silas, and I know you weren't just talking about packages. I think you're up to your neck in something that will see you spending the next few decades locked away." He violently shoved me back, a harsh, unplanned movement that made several nearby guests turn their heads in shock. David didn't care. His focus was entirely on me, his eyes wide with panic and a terrifying, unfamiliar rage. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed, his control completely gone. "You just signed your own death warrant, Amelia. You should have stayed quiet." And before I could process the true malice in that statement, before I could even take a defensive step back, I heard a new sound cutting through the high society chatter, the distinct, sharp sound of handcuffs clicking shut, not on David, but directly behind me. I slowly turned, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought the sound would carry across the room. Standing there, blocking the path to the balcony, weren't police. It was two imposing men in immaculate dark suits, clearly affiliated with Sterling's private security, but moving with the terrifying authority of agents conducting an internal investigation. And the man who stepped forward to address me wasn't one of them. It was Mr. Sterling himself, his smile gone, replaced by an expression of utter disappointment. "Amelia," Sterling said, his voice dangerously calm, "David wasn't the only one involved in this elaborate, organized scheme. We've been watching both of you for months. You see, the picture David was looking at wasn't the one you deleted." He slowly raised his own phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, and then he turned the display towards me. On the screen was a perfect high-resolution shot, not of David and Silas, but of me, last week, shaking hands with a man known only as the Broker, who is currently the prime subject in an ongoing investigation concerning large-scale financial fraud and the movement of those very suspicious crate-bound goods. "The question isn't what David did," Sterling continued, stepping closer, his eyes locking onto mine with lethal intensity. "The question is, when the authorities arrive looking for the person orchestrating this entire operation, the one who set David up to take the fall, who are they going to find standing here, looking the most guilty?" The air solidified around me. The noise of the party vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears, the sound of total reality fracturing. My breath caught somewhere between my throat and my lungs. Sterling's phone, that damned pristine screen, was a mirror reflecting back the ugliest version of myself I had ever conceived. Me, shaking hands with the Broker. It was true. The photo was real, but it wasn't meant for this moment. My engagement with the Broker was a contingency, a separate safety net I had woven precisely because I never trusted David's ambition. He was playing one game, I was playing another, far more discreet one, ensuring my own escape route should his inevitable collapse occur. I never intended for the two narratives to collide tonight, certainly not under Sterling's predatory gaze. "That's impossible," I managed to choke out, the lie feeling feeble even to my own ears. "That's a setup. David is a fool," Sterling cut in, his voice laced with venomous disappointment. He signaled subtly to the two dark-suited men flanking me. They didn't move to grab me, but their very stillness was more threatening than any physical restraint. "He thought he was the primary player, Amelia. He thought you were just his accessory, the pretty face at the corporate functions. A disposable asset much like Silas, who, by the way, is currently cooperating with federal agencies, detailing the entire operation starting from the initial movement of those substances." My world tilted again. Silas. Cooperating. David's anchor to the criminal underworld was already gone, probably singing like a canary about everything from offshore accounts to the illegal acquisition of that weaponry we only ever spoke of in code. David was trapped. And now, so was I. I turned my head sharply toward David. He was still frozen mid-shove, his eyes darting between me and Sterling, a desperate calculation warring with sheer terror on his face. David, tell him. Tell him I wasn't running the logistics network. Tell him about the offshore shell accounts you set up. I pleaded, trying to draw him back into our shared narrative of mutual destruction. David blinked, slowly shaking his head, a single devastating tear tracing a path through the expensive foundation on his cheek. He didn't look at me with remorse. He looked at me with cold, strategic clarity. "I can't do that, Amelia," he whispered, the words agonizingly slow, "because I didn't set up the offshore accounts. I only handled the domestic acquisitions for the front companies. You introduced me to the broker 3 months before we were married. You told me those accounts were necessary for tax optimization on your inherited wealth." The room spun. The accusation was so precise, so expertly delivered that it felt like a physical blow from an unseen angle. I remembered that day, that casual conversation over brunch, where I had steered him toward this perceived opportunity. I had used his ambition as a lure, believing he was the greedy one. "You're lying," I spat, desperation lending my voice a sharp edge that cut through the ambient music. "You enjoyed the money. You loved the power." "I did," David conceded, taking a staggering step forward, now looking directly at Sterling, aligning himself with the clear winner. "But I realized I was being played when I found the encrypted backups on your private server last Tuesday, the ones detailing your entire parallel setup. I thought I could use that information to leverage a better position with Sterling to save myself." He looked at me then, and there was no love, no history, just the dead, cold gaze of a survivor. "But I realized that if I testified that you were the architect, that you were the one who first dealt with the radicals involved in those Tashkoy Obvinenia allegations 2 years ago, the ones Sterling has been trying to bury, my sentence shrinks considerably. They want the puppet master, Amelia, and that's always been you." Sterling let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He's learning quickly. Now the question is, "Ms. Hayes, are you going to make this easy, or do we need to introduce you to our internal investigation team and discuss the specifics of your involvement with the distribution chain of those Zaprashony Veshchestva?" My mind raced, cataloging every piece of leverage I had left. My only hope was to expose the sheer depth of Sterling's own complicity. He couldn't afford a full internal investigation if my entanglement revealed his deeper utilization of the very criminal network he was now pretending to police. I decided to play the only card I had left: total, absolute chaos. "You want the architect, Sterling?" I yelled, my voice now booming across the stunned crowd, causing waiters to freeze mid-pour. "Fine. But you need to understand the structure I built. David didn't just play the buyer. He was the delivery man for the weapons shipment that Silas was supposed to move last year. The one that almost blew up that construction site downtown? You told him to drop it when the heat rose, didn't you, David? You told him to leave the consignment, the illegal Oruji, in the abandoned warehouse on Pier 47. David's jaw dropped again, this time not from shock, but from sheer, unadulterated terror. That information was the nuclear option. It implicated Sterling directly in a massive public safety incident involving potential unauthorized Orugia. "Amelia, stop!" David shrieked, lunging across the small gap separating us, his hands outstretched, not to restrain me, but perhaps to silence me permanently. But he was too slow. The 2 security men finally moved, smoothly intercepting David with practiced efficiency. They didn't tackle him, they simply pressed him against a decorative marble pillar, pinning his arms behind his back. As David struggled silently, his face contorted in mute horror, Sterling simply smiled, a victor's smile, utterly devoid of humanity. Pier 47? That was an unfortunate loss of inventory, Sterling mused, sounding like he was discussing a misplaced briefcase. "But you see, Amelia, That wasn't my loss. That shipment belonged to a third party, a group that dislikes loose ends even more than I do. They were expecting that delivery to facilitate their own, much larger Tajalia Obvenenia plan. Sterling leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, mimicking the intimacy I'd once shared with David. "And you see, Amelia," he purred, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to every silenced ear in the ballroom. "That third party, they've been very patient. They've been waiting for the people responsible for that missing Arugia to gather in one place for a tidy cleanup." He straightened up, his eyes glittering with triumph as he looked toward the massive, ornate double doors of the ballroom entrance. "And right on cue," Sterling announced, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "They've just arrived." The music abruptly cut out. From the massive mahogany doors came the unmistakable, rhythmic sound of heavy boots marching in perfect unison. Not the subtle, quiet approach of internal security, but the thunderous arrival of a tactical unit. And the first figure who strode into the light, illuminated by the emergency exit signs now flashing red, wasn't a federal agent, but a man I recognized instantly from the edges of David's old coded correspondences. A man notorious for delivering justice outside the confines of any legal system. He carried no badge. In his hand he held a long, menacing piece of Nezakane Aruji, and his eyes scanned the room, stopping directly on David, pinned against the pillar. "The shipment that went missing from Pier 47, the newcomer boomed, his voice echoing like judgment. "It was meant to settle a debt, and I am here to collect from everyone who touched it." The air exploded into chaos. Guests shrieked, scrambling beneath tables and tripping over priceless antiques. David, seeing the sheer, unrestrained violence embodied by the man who had just entered, ceased struggling against the security detail. His face was no longer calculating. It was the mask of a man who understood with absolute certainty that he was about to die. The leader of the tactical group, the man David's network referred to only as the Enforcer, didn't even glance at Sterling or his private security. His focus was laser-locked on David, the supposed middleman who had allowed the crucial Aruji to vanish. "Where's the rest of it, Hayes?" the Enforcer demanded, leveling the Nezakane Arugia directly at David's chest. Sterling stepped forward, trying to reclaim control, his corporate authority momentarily asserting itself over the physical threat. "Hold. This operation is under the jurisdiction of a proprietary internal security audit. You have no jurisdiction here." The Enforcer didn't even bother to turn his head fully toward Sterling. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling, a deafening crack that showered plaster dust onto the horrified attendees. "Your jurisdiction ended when you let my product become loose cargo," the Enforcer snarled, his voice raw with fury. "This isn't an audit, this is payback." David looked at me, a final desperate plea in his eyes. "Amelia, tell him I only followed your instructions about the drop-off point. Tell him I panicked." This was the moment. The choice between saving the man who betrayed me or ensuring my own survival, even if it meant condemning him to the fate I had inadvertently set in motion. I looked at David, truly looked at the wreckage of our life, built on lies and greed, the memory of his dismissive laugh at the party, the casual cruelty in his eyes when he called me emotional. It hardened something brittle inside my core. "I can't lie for you anymore, David," I stated, my voice cutting clearly through the pandemonium. I walked slowly, deliberately, toward Sterling, putting space between myself and my husband. The only thing he followed was his own greed. I only learned about Pier 47 yesterday, just like you, Mr. Sterling. I only knew about the Zaprashoni Vishwestva connection because he used my shell companies as a decoy. The Enforcer hesitated, his weapon wavering slightly between David and me. He was looking for the person with the most direct involvement in the loss of his property. Sterling, realizing his corporate shield was useless against genuine violent reprisal, seized the opportunity. He pointed dramatically at David, who was now visibly trembling, his earlier rage evaporated into pure animal fear. He is responsible for the unsecured weapons cargo, Sterling shouted to the enforcer. I had no knowledge of that specific transaction. Amelia was only brought in later to cover the financial tracks of the Tashke Obvinanya investigation, as David implicated her in that. You want the debt collector? Take the one who mismanaged the inventory. The enforcer didn't need further convincing. He saw the clear chain of command dissolving, and he saw the weakest link, the man who had clearly failed his employers. He shifted his aim back to David. Too late for shifting blame, Hayes. David didn't beg. He closed his eyes just as the enforcer pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was final, brutal, and deafeningly loud. David slumped against the marble pillar, the heavy silence returning immediately after the deafening crack. The dark stain blooming rapidly on his crisp white shirt was the only evidence of the Golden Boy's spectacular demise. The enforcer kept his weapon trained on the scene, his gaze sweeping across the survivors cowering near the walls. He paused, locking eyes with me. I stood beside Sterling, my face a carefully constructed mask of horrified shock, the picture of the wronged, betrayed wife. And you, the enforcer addressed me, his voice quieter now, laced with weary finality. Your entanglement with the broker? That's a separate case. But know this, I clean up messes. I don't start them. He looked at Sterling, nodding once, a grim acknowledgement of an uneasy truce. The immediate debt is settled. Keep your house clean, Sterling. If any of this resurfaces or if any further shipments go missing, I will return for the next person in line. Then, as abruptly as they arrived, the enforcer and his men marched out, the heavy boots fading back into the night. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of distant sirens, finally arriving to deal with the aftermath of mass panic. Sterling let out a long, shaky breath, turning to me. The predator in his eyes had been replaced by something cautious, calculating. Well, Amelia, he said, surveying the wreckage of his party, the dead body of his star employee lying a few feet away. It appears we both survived tonight. You managed to pivot spectacularly under pressure. You handed me David, and you threw me just enough plausible deniability concerning the Tashke Obvinanya to keep me from calling in the authorities on you right this second. He extended a hand, not for comfort, but for an alliance forged in shared atrocity. You played the long game brilliantly. Now, we have a very large, very messy cleanup operation ahead of us. We need to ensure that the story the police hear is one of David's isolated, desperate actions, followed by a justifiable, tragic end. I looked down at David's still form, the man I had married, the man I had tried to expose, the man who had ultimately signed my freedom ticket by betraying me first. The grief wasn't for him. It was for the sheer, terrifying realization of how easily I had been manipulated by everyone around me, including myself. I placed my hand in Sterling's. It felt cold, clammy, and utterly necessary. Agreed, Mr. Sterling, I whispered, meeting his gaze without blinking. We start by explaining exactly how David was driven to such extremes by paranoia. Paranoia that I was finally wise enough to see through. As the first uniformed officers burst through the doors, their faces grim, I let a single perfect tear trace a path down my cheek, a tear not of sorrow, but of calculated victory. I had lost everything but my life, and in this new, brutal reality, that was the ultimate prize. But as I turned to give my statement, I knew one thing for certain. Sterling wouldn't keep me close for long. He had used me, and the moment I was no longer useful in burying the past, I would become the next target for his meticulous cleanup. I looked over my shoulder one last time at David's body, and a new thought crystallized, sharp and clear. I learned how to survive tonight, and I will not be the next package to disappear.